Okay, we're going to take a stab at chapter 9, one of my favorite chapters. And so much of the chapter is relatable, I think, to many of you, so I think you'll enjoy it as well. Plus, there's many things in the chapter that are kind of controversial and discussable. Too bad we can't be face to face and have larger discussions on some of these issues, but I'll try to bring them up as we go through. So, first of all, the chapter is lifespan development, which basically implies that development occurs across the entire lifespan from birth to death. However, we're going to talk about prenatal development as well, because things happen during prenatal development that are important for the rest of our lives as well. Just want to relate this to something else that we've already talked about. Freud believed that all development that was important basically occurred in the first 5 to 7 years of a child's life. He said something like, the child is the father of the man, and of course that would be a sexist way of saying it. We would say today the child is the parent of the adult. He believed that the first 5 to 7 years of a child's life determine the rest of the child's life. And basically, the rest of your life, you're simply acting out the scripts that you learned in the first 5 to 7 years of your life. Keeping in mind that you have these inborn instincts that are really important to Freud as well. But the learning that occurs that adds to those instincts that we're born with is really only going to occur in the first 5 to 7 years of a child's life. Of course, Freud was, as usual, too extreme and not correct in his extreme views of the sole importance of childhood. However, I want to point out that if you were to take any 5 to 7 years of a person's life and determine which 5 to 7 years are the most important in a person's life, I would think you would find that it's going to be the first 5 to 7 years. So he was on the right track again, but the truth is that development occurs across the lifespan, and things happen throughout our lives that can influence who we are, influence our personalities, our values, our belief systems, and the way that we interact with the world. All right, so with that in mind, there are 3 stages of prenatal development that typically get discussed. The first one is the germinal stage, or sometimes called the zygotic stage. So-called the zygotic stage because we start the stage as a zygote, a single-celled organism. When the egg is fertilized by the sperm, 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs, floats down the fallopian tube, gets implanted in the uterine wall, and that process from conception to implantation in the uterine wall typically takes 10 days to 3 weeks. We're going to say that this stage primarily lasts on average about 2 weeks, but it could last anywhere from 10 days to 3 weeks. Primarily what's happening in this stage is cell duplication. You go from one single cell, after about 24 hours you got 2. That's the process of mitosis that you learn about in a human biology class or another kind of biology class. The 2 cells are identical to the first one. They split and 2 become 4, and they split and the 4 become 8. That mitosis, cell duplication, occurs slowly at first, but it just picks up speed and happens so rapidly after that it's been stated that, putting aside all questions at this point and when life begins, we'll just say, for the sake of this discussion, that life begins at conception, even though that may not be technically true and believed by many of you. But saying that it begins at conception, it's possible to say that you grow no faster in your entire life than you do during the first 2 weeks of your existence post-conception. You don't really grow in size, you grow in number of cells. You don't grow in specialization of tissue. So there's not, in all that mitotic cellular division, there's not a whole lot of differentiation of tissue and specialization of tissue. So you start as a single cell, but you advance to a multicellular organism at the end of 2 to 3 weeks. But you're still roughly the same size and the same shape as you were when you started at conception. It's been stated that as many as half of all fertilized eggs don't make it past the first, is talking about human eggs, don't make it past the first 2 weeks. The rest of them get spontaneously aborted because something's wrong. By the time the period of gestation is up for humans, 30, 36, 38 weeks, 3/4 of all fertilized eggs don't make it. All right, so here's a picture of a human egg. You can see that it's quite large relative to the sperm that are on the outside here. The egg is the largest cell in the human body, about the size of a period at the end of a sentence in your textbook. You can see that the sperm is relatively quite a bit smaller. 2 sperm on the surface of an egg trying to get in. No, this is not the way that we make twins. There are different types of twins, right? So fraternal twins are 2 different eggs fertilized by 2 different sperm, and they happen to be developing in the uterus at the same time. So fraternal twins can be different sexes. They can even be different races. If the woman is playing around, having multiple sex partners within the time that she's ovulating, and she ovulates multiple eggs, she could have multiple eggs fertilized by 2 different men, and they could be carried in her womb at the same time. Fraternal twins, because they come from 2 different eggs and 2 different sperm, they're going to be similar if they're of the same 2 parents, but they're only going to share roughly about half of the same genes. Identical twins are going to share all of the same genes, because identical twins are also called monozygotic twins. They come from the same zygote, so it's one egg fertilized by 1 sperm. During the process of mitosis, after conception, when there's a cellular division, probably within the first, say, 5 or 6 cellular divisions, if they split apart completely rather than split apart and then continue to develop within the same overall organism, if they split apart completely and then continue to develop separately, then you have identical twins, monozygotic twins. You can have conjoined twins. Conjoined twins are identical twins that started to separate from each other, but didn't quite completely separate, and so they're still connected and developing separately. Sometimes you have parasitic twins. These kind of twins are conjoined twins that didn't separate completely. One of the twins develops normally and completely, and the other one kind of becomes subsumed into the other one, into the one that's developing normally, and it can become kind of a cyst or a tumor. And many times you never know that you have this other twin inside of you. Where it has been known to occur is maybe a woman is trying to get pregnant and she can't for whatever reason, so they go in and they take a look at her fallopian tubes and her ovaries and uterus and all that, and they find out that she's got a huge tumor in there, a huge cyst, and so they try to get it out, and they get it out, and they look at it, and it's a twin of the host that never really developed. It may just be a whole bunch of hair or teeth or skin or something a lot like that. It just didn't develop normally like the other one. So anyway, one of these sperm is going to get in at best. The other one is not. Here's one sperm burrowing into the surface of an egg. The egg fights it off, tries to fight it off as if it were an invader, and erodes the surface material at the head of the sperm, and that exposes the DNA in the sperm. It spills out, lines up with the DNA in the egg, and you got conception. So after conception, again, a couple of weeks later, it's going to implant in the uterine wall, and that's the germinal or the zygotic stage of prenatal development. The second stage is the embryonic stage. It's going to last from about 2 to 3 weeks to about 8 weeks. So still, at the end of this period, a woman may not know that she's pregnant. It's just going to be a couple of months into it. Primarily what's happening in this stage is cell differentiation or specialization of tissue. So duplication, mitosis, is still happening here, but it's overshadowed by the amount of specialization that's going on. Just to give you an idea of how this kind of works, this is a 4-week-old embryo. Still relatively amorphous. It's hard to determine what that's going to be. You can't really tell the difference between, at 4 weeks, a human embryo or a chicken embryo in many ways. But 2 weeks later, this is a 6-week-old human embryo. You can begin to see the internal organs, the cephalus, the head area, and the spine, and the lower body. Just in 2 weeks' time, it's gone from that to that. And 2 weeks later, this is an 8-week-old embryo. It's got a clearly definable head with facial features, arms, hands, fingers, and legs and toes. In fact, it has 100% of the internal organs it's ever going to have, and 90% of 90+% of the external features it's ever going to have. Very easily identifiable as a human embryo at 8 weeks. So you go from this to this in 4 short weeks. So you can get an idea of the tremendous amount of specialization and how fast it is occurring during this period. Let's take a look at some of the biology of abortion. If you're pro-life, or you've seen people who are pro-life advocate against abortion, what you see, or what you may be involved with, is a message that shows this here, basically, that an 8-week-old embryo looks like a human, and emphasizes the fact that at 8 weeks it has a heart that pumps blood. In fact, the heart's been pumping blood since about 3 weeks. It has fingers and toes that move. If it has heart that pumps blood and has fingers and toes that move, that means it has a nervous system. Those neurons that we discussed in chapter 2 are firing to a certain extent. They're working to show some human activity. If you're on the pro-choice side, or we'll just say if you're okay with abortion under certain circumstances, one of the things that you're probably going to point out is, okay, the pro-life people will point out all the development that has occurred at this point, but the question is can it survive if it's born? The fact is an 8-week-old embryo going on a fetus that it has 100% of its internal features is never going to survive on its own. At 10 weeks, at 15 weeks, at 16 weeks, at 20 weeks, it's not going to survive on its own. The statistics say that at about 22 weeks, about 5% of fetuses, if born, because at 22 weeks it's now a fetus, at 22 weeks, about 5% of fetuses, if born, live. And that's after a tremendous amount of support and intervention that we give. At 24 weeks, a fetus, if born, will live 50% of the time. At 28 weeks, a fetus, if born, will live 90% of the time. So from 22 to 28 weeks or so, you have tremendous amount of development that's occurring that allows this fetus to be able to survive if born, to take advantage of the heroic efforts that we throw at it to be able to allow it to live. We would say that, therefore, that the age of viability on average is going to be 24 weeks. So the age of viability is the age at which a fetus can survive if born. So on average, it's going to be about 24 weeks, which is about 6 months. So let's go to talk about the fetal stage. So the fetal stage is the longest stage. It lasts from 8 to 38 weeks. What's happening is a further refining of all that growth, that foundational growth that's occurred in the embryonic stage, so that this fetus can be able to sustain life. And every day and every week is important, even through 38 weeks. to make sure that this infant, when born, has the best chance of surviving. Every day is important, but generally fetuses will survive if born after 28 weeks. Again, the age of viability is really important in this stage. It's about 24 weeks. So you can see there there's a biological argument in favor of both those who are against abortion and those who are okay with abortion. This is a 16-week-old fetus. Under Roe versus Wade, this fetus could be aborted. Fetus can be aborted prior to 24 weeks. States cannot pass laws prohibiting abortion prior to 24 weeks based on the Supreme Court rendering in Roe versus Wade that relies upon the scientific information that shows that fetuses generally don't survive if born prior to 24 weeks, and they have a pretty good chance of surviving after 24 weeks. So that being the age of viability, when the fetus is not viable prior to that age of viability, they should be able to be aborted, and after that the states can pass laws prohibiting abortion because the fetus is viable. I just want to point out that even though under Roe versus Wade, this 16-week-old fetus would be able to be aborted, you're not going to find many doctors who will perform the abortion on a fetus that's 16 weeks along, because it does, as you can see, this does look a lot more human-like and a lot more lifelike, and it's much more closer to be able to sustain life than an 8-week-old fetus. Teratogens are things that can adversely affect development prenatally. There are probably as many teratogens as there are things. Let's just talk about a few of them. So smoking is a common one that gets mentioned. The biggest effect of smoking is low birth weight and an increase in infant mortality. Infants that are exposed to a lot of smoke from the mother or the father in the environment, prenatally, their development tends to be retarded. They tend to be born low birth weight, and an infant that's born at 5.5 pounds is 40 times more likely to die in the first year of life than an infant that is normal weight, which would be about 7.5 pounds. And so low birth weight is a huge issue in infant mortality, and it turns out that infant mortality is we have one of the highest infant mortality rates in the world in the United States. In comparison with other industrialized countries. We just don't do a really good job of educating people of all the things that they need to do to make sure that their infants are healthy and strong when born. And that includes making sure that women don't smoke and fetuses aren't developing embryos and fetuses aren't subjected to any kind of smoke or teratogens in the environment. And of course, there's also the healthcare issue. We don't really have adequate healthcare for all people. We have good healthcare for those who are employed, who have money to be able to afford it. But many people don't have the healthcare that they need to be able to live in such a way and have medical care and intervention in such to the extent that it helps them to be healthy and to raise and have healthy children. And another reason why, obviously, there's been so much emphasis in the last several years on Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act and making sure that health care is available to all old people. Alcohol is a major a major teratogen in that it tends to be a leading cause of mental retardation. The fact is that most women at some point will ingest alcohol while they're pregnant. Most women will not use alcohol and definitely not abuse it once they know they're pregnant. But the fact is that alcohol is a part of pretty much everybody's life in the U.S. and the world. And so if a woman is drinking and possibly pregnant at the same time and not knowing it, then there's going to be some alcohol in the system when the baby's developing. Now we know that all of these teratogens can exert their effects and have negative effects throughout the entire period of gestation, the whole 38 weeks. But the most vulnerable time for a fetus or an embryo is the first 8 weeks, 8 to 12 weeks. And if during that time you're exposing your embryo or fetus to teratogens like smoking or alcohol, because you don't know that you're pregnant, then you're really kind of in a dicey, kind of dangerous period where you can have a lot of unintended effects on the developing embryo or fetus. Other drugs, obviously street drugs, heroin, opioids, cocaine, those things can have negative effects on developing embryos and fetuses. I'm not going to talk about those. I'm going to talk about Prozac, Xanax, Buspar, Risperdal, and those kind of medications that many people who struggle with mental illnesses are taking. And I want to mention those because it's a real common issue today. Looking at the bottom here, stress associated with anxiety and depression, these things affect your biochemistry. And so those things are teratogens as well. So a lot of women today are faced with the difficult decision with their partners and with their doctors. Should I continue to take this medication, which may have a teratogenic effect on my future infant? Or should I stop the medication and hope that the depression or the anxiety or whatever it is that I'm prone to doesn't get so bad that it becomes another problem entirely? So many women are going to be faced with that choice today because many people are taking medications today for the mental illness issues that they're dealing with. And it's a decision that is difficult to make and must be taken with a great deal of consideration and expert advice, I think. Viruses like the flu, like the COVID-19, cytomegaloviruses, rubella, these things, and probably many others that we're not aware of, they can affect HIV, and they can affect the developing fetus as well. All right, now, hopefully, when you have a baby, you don't expose this baby to too many teratogens, and the baby has developed normally internally. So cognitive development is primarily a study of how we change, how our thinking changes, how our intellectual processes change over the lifespan. Jean Piaget is probably the most famous cognitive psychologist. Not necessarily the most correct. He's not without debate or controversy, but I do think that he captured many years ago a good picture of how children develop their thinking abilities. He wasn't so much interested in the development of intelligence. He was interested in the development of thinking skills, keeping in mind that thinking is different from intelligence. You could be highly intelligent and not really be that capable of a thinker, not be all that creative or that deep in your thinking. That Piaget's ideas basically contribute to a whole philosophy of teaching young children that suggests we need to focus on teaching them giving them opportunities to learn how to think better as they grow older. So what Piaget said was that when kids are first born, they don't really think. In fact, it takes them the first 2 years of their life to be able to learn to think with their mind in the way that adults generally do. He calls this stage the sensory motor stage. Now, he has 4 stages of development. First of all, we're in this first stage. We're born without any thinking abilities, and we just gradually develop them over the first 2 years. Piaget's basic observation that allows him to say that kids don't think when they're first born, infants don't think when they're first born, in fact, don't really think with their minds until they're about 6 months of age, is based on the idea of object permanence. Object permanence is the idea that objects and people exist outside of the perception of them. So if an infant operates with the world kind of in an out of sight, out of mind sort of way, that suggests that maybe this infant is not really thinking with its mind. One of the reasons why young infants like the game of peekaboo is because for them, according to Piaget and according to some thinking, the world really doesn't exist when they're not seeing it. And so if you cover your eyes in front of your infant, and the infant can't see your eyes because your eyes basically are you, your face is you. If your infant can't see that, then you don't exist. Out of sight, out of mind. One of the advantages of that for parents is that parents of young infants can leave their infants home with a babysitter and go off on a date or whatever, and the infant doesn't have a whole lot of difficulty, doesn't fuss and miss the parents because the infant can't think about them in their absence. The parents don't exist. Separation anxiety is strongest from 6 months to about 18 months after the point at which infants learn object permanence. And then going back to the peekaboo thing, peekaboo is fun for an infant at first, but after a while, after 4 to 6 months or so, somewhere beyond that, infants know you exist, and so you cover your face, cover your eyes, and they know you're there, and so they'll pry your fingers off your face, and for them it's no longer fun anymore, and for the parents it's no longer fun anymore as well. Many years ago when I was lecturing on this topic, I was kind of developing in my mind and sitting in the living room of our house with one of my daughters on my lap with her blanket nearby, and she had her pacifier in her mouth. She was extremely deeply attached to this pacifier. And I knew that if I pulled it out of her mouth that she would fuss and struggle and want it back. So at 4 or 5 months of age, she definitely conveyed to us, and we knew that she was attached to her pacifier, and that she had the ability to convey to us what she wanted. She had the ability to reach and to grasp and to get things that she wanted. She could crawl around and scoot around the room and get things that she wanted, and she showed interest in things. But the question is did she really understand that the pacifier existed when she wasn't seeing it, when she wasn't sensing it? And so to sort of test this, as she's sitting on my lap, I pulled the pacifier out of her mouth, and I quickly hid it underneath a blanket that was right on the floor in front of us. And as I did that, grabbed it out of her mouth, she tried to grab it with her hand, and as I was going down to the blanket, she was tracking it with her hand and her eyes, and as soon as I put it underneath the edge of the blanket and she couldn't see it anymore, she lost kind of the motivation and the ability to continue to focus on it, and she was distracted by whatever else she was seeing or hearing or sensing at that time, and it wasn't the pacifier. And so those things became the center of her attention. And even though she saw me put that pacifier underneath the blanket, and she could actually see the bulge underneath the edge of the blanket right where I put it, she didn't reach under the blanket to pull it out. And after a while of waiting for her to reach under there and pull out the pacifier that she just saw me put under there, I gently and slowly pulled it out, and as soon as she saw it, she grabbed it with her hand, put it in her mouth, started sucking, and a few minutes later, when she was back to kind of baseline again, I pulled the pacifier out of her mouth and put it underneath the blanket, and the very same thing happened. She watched me put it under there, and the second time you would think that she would have some memory and ability to realize that, hey, there's a pattern here. He took the pacifier out of my mouth and he put it under the blanket, and they pulled it out, and it's there again. But she didn't reach under there to pull it out and put it in her mouth, and I knew she had the ability to do that. Realizing she wasn't going to reach under there and do that again, a few minutes later, I reached under there, pulled the pacifier out, put it in her mouth. She put it in her mouth, and then I pulled it out again and put it under the blanket. So we did that 3 times, and never during those 3 times did she ever indicate that she knew the pacifier was underneath the blanket. She didn't reach under there and pull it out and put it in her mouth, even though she had the ability to do that. So for Piaget, that means out of sight, out of mind. These kids aren't able to think about things that they're not sensing. So in a sense, that's Piaget's definition of thinking. Thinking is your ability to hold something in your mind and to work with it, to manipulate it, manipulate it and to act on it, even though you're not seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, or smelling it. And even though that may be kind of a different definition of thinking than you had in mind, I think it does kind of work, and it makes a little bit of sense that in this sense, kids are not really thinking with their mind like they will later on. What happens after 6 months when they learn object permanence, and at that point, if you pull the pacifier out of their mouth and you put it underneath the blanket, they're going to reach under the blanket and pull it out and put it back in their mouth. Or if it's the bottle or the rattle, they're gonna look for the object where you hit it. But there's still a problem here, just to illustrate the kind of evolution and ability here, and the reason why this stage lasts from 0 to 2 as opposed to 0 to 6 months, is because that development of thinking with the mind is gradual and slow. So Piaget came up with this task. So he actually did these tasks himself with young kids, and he was the one that inspired me to do that little test with my daughter. He would have 2 blankets in a later version of this little task, blanket A and blanket B. So he'd take the rattle or the bottle or the pacifier and he'd hide it under blanket A when the child was, say, 6 months of age and had shown the ability to understand object permanence. He'd hide it under blanket A. The child would look under blanket A, pull it out, and use the object, the pacifier, the bottle, or the rattle. And then he'd take the object again and he'd put it underneath blanket A, and the child would look under there and find it. And then he'd put it under blanket A again. So several times he'd put it under blanket A. And every time the child who understands object permanence, who's likely going to be 5, 6, 7, 8 months of age. But then the parent would then, researcher Piaget would put the object under blanket B. And now the child would look. The question is would the child look under blanket A where it used to be all the time, or under blanket B where the child just saw it being hidden? And what Piaget found is that the child in that situation would inevitably look under blanket A. Why? Because their thinking still has not developed to the point where they can take everything into account and realize, wow, he put it under blanket A 5 times in a row, but now he put it under blanket B, so that's where I'm going to look at it. By about 12 months of age, Piaget found that the AB error, the blanket AB error that they tend to make from 6 to 12 months tends to disappear. So at 12, 13, 14 months, infants will look under where they just saw this object hidden, not where it was hidden in the past. Then Piaget began to change the nature of the tests a little more, and he would say, okay, to the infant, okay, this bottle or pacifier that you're extremely attached to that you want, I've hidden in this room someplace. And now we're talking about infants between the ages of 12 and 18 months. I've hidden this object in this room someplace. You find it. See if you can find it. And what Piaget found was that between 12 and 18 months, these kids tend to look at you, look at around the room a little bit. They twiddle their thumbs, but they don't really do much of anything to be able to find that thing. Now, if you're really thinking with your mind, you're conceiving of all the possible locations where it might be in this room. So you're thinking, well, it might be over there underneath that pillow, or it might be under the couch, or it might be in that drawer, or behind that picture. So I'm going to check out each one of those places like a little scientist and see if it's there. And if it's not there, then I'm going to go to the next one. What Piaget found was that between 12 and 18 months, kids generally did not have that ability to do that. And so Piaget called this the problem of hidden displacements. Up until now, all the time, the hiding places were seen. The place where the object was hidden was right there in front of their eyes. But now the hiding place was hidden from the child, and Piaget wanted to know if they could conceive of the possible hiding places and check each one out. And they're generally not able to do that until about 18 months. And so from 18 to 24 months is when kids begin to finish this stage, because that's when they begin to handle both hidden displacements and everything before that. If I hide this object someplace in the room, the infant the child between 18 and 24 months or so is going to begin to be able to conceive of many possibilities where it might be and begin to be much better at being able to find it. And so for Piaget, that means that they're beginning to think with their mind and not just with their sensory and motor reflexes. And so further evidence that they've progressed from this stage and they're beginning to move into the next one is their ability to pretend, their ability to deceive and to tell little lies. All those things suggest that they're thinking with their mind, and their ability to use language. So language, if you think about it, is attaching symbolic words for objects and other things that we deal with. And so it's definitely a mental kind of cognitive thinking process. If I can relate this object, mouse, to the word mouse, then in my mind I'm creating that association. And the more I can do that, the better facility with language I'm going to have. And so language becomes a huge indicator of my ability to think. So those three things: pretending, beginning to lie a little bit, using a great deal of language, learning language really quickly, suggests for Piaget and many others that kids finally have gotten to the point that they're thinking with their minds as their primary tool. And that takes them into the next stage, which is pre-operations from ages from 2 to 7. Now, the good news about this stage is that these kids can think with their minds. They're developing well, but the problem is they lack a good logical system for thinking. They don't consistently follow the logical rules of thinking. And so for Piaget, they're said to be in the pre-operations state. Pre-operations means literally pre-logical thinking. Think of operational thinking as logical thinking. The fact is that 2 to 7-year-old kids are fun and interesting and cute because they have this interesting combination of amazing intelligence and quick learning and creativity, but at the same time, they're pretty naive. One of the best examples of illogical thinking of a 2 to 7-year-old is egocentricity. Egocentricity for Piaget means the inability to take the perspective of other people, to kind of see the world from one's own perspective, and that's it. Let's go back to the peekaboo example. Piaget found that 2, 3, 4-year-old children, if you cover their eyes, and ask them, "Can I see you?" The 2, 3-year-old child will often say, "No." And it appears that the reasoning is, the only thing I really know for certain is what I can sense and perceive, and since I can't see you, then you must not be able to see me. You can try that at home with your own kids or little kids that you know. If you cover their eyes when they're 2, 3, perhaps 4 years of age, they will say that you can't see them. And then when you play hide and go seek with them, you hide in a place. They find you, and of course you've hidden in a place that's pretty easily found because you don't want to make the game too challenging that they stop playing it. They find you, and then it's their turn to hide. They hide in the same place. Again, you can observe this in your own kids or kids that you interact with. You'll find that when they play hide and seek at that young age, they hide in the most crazy places that the parent hid in, or maybe in places that simply hide their head, one part of their body, that major part of their body. And since they can't see you because their head is behind the couch or something, even though the rest of their body is exposed, you can't see them, is the thinking. And so that's a good hiding place. And then when you find them and then the parent hides, and now it's the child's turn to hide themselves again, they hide in the same place they hid before because they're still relatively egocentric and illogical in their way of thinking. They can't really conceive of They can't really get into the mind of somebody else and realize, gee, that she's probably going to know that I might hide in this place here because that's where she hid or I hid before. And so since she knows that's a logical hiding place, I'm not going to use that because I want to hide someplace else where she wouldn't be able to find me. That kind of thinking, which requires non-egocentric thinking, getting in the mind of somebody else, is not very common in 2, 3, 4-year-old kids. Other examples of egocentric thinking, you're watching TV with a 3-year-old, they're in the way, and so you ask them to move out of the way, and 5 minutes later, after they moved out of the way, they're back in the way of the TV, and you have to tell them again because you can't see. And it's as if they're going in their mind, well, I can see fine. What's the problem with you? Why can't you see? I can see fine. If they really understood your perspective and that you see the world differently and you have a different perspective of the TV than they do, then they would have a better ability to stay out of the way. It's also common for 2, 3, 4-year-old kids when they talk to each other to engage in a collective monologue or engage in parallel speech. So child A talks and child B talks, and then A talks, and then B talks, and A talks, and they never really intersect like they need to do to have a decent conversation. They're talking more about what they said the last time they spoke as opposed to what the other child in between. So they're carrying on this conversation because they learn turn taking at that young age, but they haven't really learned how to interact with each other in a real way that shows understanding of the other person. Very typical of very young children. Also, young children coming home from preschool will go, "Hey mom, look at what I drew in preschool," and mom's or dad, whoever it is busy Facebooking or whatever on his or her phone and doesn't really take the time or the effort to look at the child's artwork, but says, "Oh, it's fantastic. You're a great artist. You did a great job." And the 2, 3, 4-year-old kid buys it totally, doesn't really realize that mom or dad needs to actually physically get off the phone and look at that artwork. When the child realizes that mom or dad have a different perspective and they really need to be able to physically look at something to be able to genuinely praise the artwork, then the child goes, no mom, look what I did. You have to look at it. Get off your phone. Look at my artwork. And you can get away with saying, "Oh, that's great," even if you haven't seen it, because they're less egocentric. So anyway, there's actually probably many examples of the egocentric thinking that young kids display. And I want to talk about something, though, that other people bring up who argue with Piaget a little bit. Some say that Piaget was wrong, kind of like Freud was wrong, in the extreme view that he had. Piaget said that kids lack the ability to take the perspective of other people. There's actually some research that's described in the book that shows that that's not completely right. Kids do have the ability to think logically and systematically and from the perspective of other people in some ways and in relationship to some things. And so one of the things that they point out where kids tend to show empathy and the ability to get in the minds of other people is in the area of emotion. So when a person is happy or sad, 3, 4-year-old kids have a great ability, who may be egocentric in many other ways, they have a great ability to kind of get in the head of the other person feeling these emotions and to feel those emotions along with them. So just as an example of that, many years ago, I dropped a big pan on my bare foot in the kitchen, and my wife and 2 older daughters were in the kitchen talking and doing whatever, and while this happened, they didn't pay a whole lot of attention. But my 3-year-old daughter, as I'm kind of moaning and groaning and in great pain, grabbing my toes and hobbling over to the couch to try to land there and get off my pained foot at that point. My 3-year-old daughter had followed me over there, and very soon after I got there, she was wanting to give me her blanket. She wanted to give me a Band-Aid. She wanted to kiss my owie. She was giving me all sorts of sympathy. And in a sense, you could say that she understood that I was in pain and she was sort of feeling that pain. And she was showing non-egocentric thinking, correct? Well, that's what a lot of people say is true. But the Piagetian perspective is that actually, if you think about it, if this 3-year-old daughter of mine was really in my head, chances are she wouldn't be giving me her blanket or giving me a Band-Aid. She wouldn't be wanting to kiss my owie or anything like that. That's what she would want if she was in that situation. So she's still really in her own head. She's not really in my head. So I would argue that that perspective is the correct one, that this is also an example of where kids are egocentric. And just to think about it a little further, if she really was in my head and not egocentric, she would say to herself, wow, Dad, when I'm hurt like that, if I had that pan fall on my foot and my toes were hurting, I'd want you to give me the blanket and the Barney Band-Aid or the Little Mermaid Band-Aid or whatever it is. But I know you're different and you probably want to be left alone because that's the way you are. Or you want your Sports Illustrated or some other magazine that you like to read. So I'll give you that. But 3-year-olds don't do that. They don't think that way. We don't expect that out of them because we know that they're egocentric. Anyway, I just want to point out another example I forgot to mention. Piaget had a little task that he used to measure kids' thinking abilities on all these levels. I already mentioned the pacifier or the bottle or the rattle task for object permanence in the first stage. In this stage, he would use the 3 mountain problem. What he would do is he would have a little table here with 4 chairs around each side, or 1 chair around each side of the table, so 4 chairs on all 4 sides of the table. And in the center of the table, there would be 3 mountains, a relief map of 3 mountains, a tall one, a medium-sized one, and a small one. And then in front of each chair, there would be 4 pictures. One picture would be what the mountain arrangement would look like from that perspective. And another picture would be what the mountain arrangement would look like from this perspective. And then, in other words, the other chair, the next chair around the table. And then another picture would represent what the mountains would look like from that perspective on the other side of the table. And then the last picture would be what the mountains would look like from this perspective, this last table at the chair. And the child would be seated at one of those chairs and would be asked to point to the picture that depicts what they're seeing from their perspective. And of course, the child would pick out the right picture. And then the child would say, now imagine that you're sitting across the table from you on the other side. In fact, they would put a stuffed animal on the other side. Imagine you're in the position of Eeyore on the other side, or Winnie the Pooh, or some character in Winnie the Pooh. Imagine you are in the position of Eeyore on the other side of the table. What does Eeyore see? Point to the picture that Eeyore is seeing. And what picture does the child point to? The same one that they're seeing from their perspective. And the same is true for this perspective and that perspective. No matter where you ask them to imagine they're sitting at the table, they will say that the perspective that they would see from that view would be the one that they're seeing now. And again, that's the way kids are between the ages of 2, 3, and 4 years of age. Now, it turns out that at the end of this stage, toward the end of this stage, 5, 6, 7 years of age, and mostly 6, 7 years of age, kids begin to be a lot less egocentric, and they become a lot more logical in their thinking. I would argue they become a lot less cute as well, a lot less fun, but that's the way we want them to develop. We want them to develop logically and non-egocentrically in order to be able to deal with the real world appropriately. Another thing that's going on for Piaget is something called conservation. The idea of conservation is that objects maintain things like their weight, their volume, their amounts, even if other aspects of these objects have changed. So for instance, a glass of water if it's in a small, wide, if the water's in a small, wide container, and then you take that same water and you pour it into a taller, narrower container, the water is going to be the same amount. It's conserved or maintained its same amount, even though the shape of the water has changed. And the weight of the water, the volume of the water, is still going to be the same, whether it's in this container or that container. That's called the principle of conservation, and that's an element of logical thinking. Kids, when they become logical, have the ability to understand the concept of conservation. Things like water conserve their amounts, even if these other characteristics of the object has changed. So for Piaget, another task that he would use for these young kids is he would show them 2 glasses of water. The glasses being the same size, same shape, and the water arising to the same level in each glass. And then have the child acknowledge that they're the same amounts, the water is the same in each. And then he would take one of these glasses and pour it into a taller, narrower glass, and then ask the child, now, is the water in this glass the same as the water in this glass? Or is this one more, or is that one more? And the 5-year-old child will inevitably say that the water in the taller, narrower glass is more. So they don't understand the object of conservation. Now, beginning at the age of 7, if you give that test to young children, they will say that it's the amount. The amount's the same. If you ask them to explain why, they have the ability to say things like this, again, beginning around the age of 7. They'll say, well, all you did is you took this water that was the same as this other water when it was in this other container. These waters were the same amount. And all you did is you took this one and you poured it into a taller, narrower one. So the water raised to a higher level in the taller, narrower glass, but you didn't add any, you didn't take any away, so there's the same amount of water. And they'll be able to say things like, well, this glass is taller, but this one's wider. And so, in a sense, there's a reciprocal relationship between the height and the width here, and they cancel each other out. They're probably not going to use that sort of language, but they have the ability to understand in some ways this reciprocal relationship between the wideness and the tallness. They cancel each other out, and so it's got to be the same amount. And they can also do something like Piaget called reversibility. They can take that water from the taller, narrow glass, put it back in the wider glass, and show that it's at the same level as the original glass of water. That's called reversibility, where they can reverse the operations that they just saw and prove to you that they know that's how they know that it's the same amount of water. So this presents kind of an issue for young children and parents when they are like giving graham crackers to these children at a party or some sort of eating get-together. And if the graham crackers, if you have one whole graham cracker, and every child's going to get a whole one, but if it turns out that one kid gets a graham cracker that has to be broken into 2, because they're now 2 pieces, the very young children who are egocentric will think that the one who got the 2 pieces, and illogical in their thinking, the one who got the 2 pieces has more than everybody else who had just 1 piece. So even if it's the same amount, the one who got that amount broken into 2 pieces somehow has more. And so you have to deal with upset kids because they got more. He got more than I did because he got 2. All right, so the third stage for Piaget is called concrete operations. This is 7 to 11 years of age. This is where kids enjoy logical thinking, and they also understand the concept of conservation, as I just said. The problem with this stage is that they can only think logically about concrete things. They can only think logically, consistently about things that they've had experience with. They have a hard time thinking logically about abstract concepts like life after death and love and relationships, nuclear war, abortion, deforestation, religion. Now, I want to point out something that is not really something that Piaget made a big deal about, but I think it's relevant here. If you think about when kids stop believing in Santa Claus and Easter Bunny, it tends to be around 7 to 8 years of age on average. Now, you might say that the reason why kids stop believing in Santa Claus and Easter Bunny is because they have experiences. That would be the behavioral view of this. Their experiences teach them that Santa Claus doesn't exist. Maybe they saw a Christmas present that they later got on Christmas morning from Santa. They remember seeing it in the closet or hearing mom and dad talking about it ahead of time, and they put two and two together and they realize that Santa Claus doesn't really exist. But Piaget said that the reason why kids believe in Santa Claus early on is because they can't really think about it logically enough to comprehend that. It just doesn't make sense. In fact, what we do for young kids is we perpetuate their illogical beliefs in Santa Claus and Easter Bunny and the like by giving them pseudo-logical answers to their logical questions. In a sense, they are showing their development when they begin to ask questions like, why does mom and Santa Claus have the same writing? Look, this says from Santa, this says from mom, but it's the same writing. Why does mom and Santa Claus have the same wrapping paper? Or how does Santa Claus do it? We don't even have a chimney. How does he get into our house? When they're asking those kinds of questions, that shows they're developing logically. They're becoming better thinkers. And then we give these pseudo-logical answers to their questions to perpetuate their beliefs. Because we want to maintain their childhood innocence and their fun a little bit longer. But in a sense, we're doing them a disservice when we give them these pseudo-logical answers. One of our daughters, she was 7 or 8, she had begun to question Santa Claus, and she was saying things like, Dad, you're Santa Claus, aren't you? And I kind of did the Piagetian thing. I didn't say one way or another that she was right or wrong. I said, well, that's interesting observation or question. Why do you think I'm Santa Claus? And then she would explain this and that. And I'd say, well, think about it some more and see if, let me know when you figure it out completely. So Piaget kind of dealt that way, thought that's the way education should be. You don't force knowledge on kids. You let them explore and ask the questions that they're interested in when they're interested in them. And gradually, through their own explorations and their own attempts to understand the truth, they will find out the answers. So we have to give them all sorts of opportunities to explore and experiment on the world, but we don't force feed knowledge on them. And so I was trying not to force feed what I know about Santa Claus and Easter Bunny on my daughter. I was leaving it up to her. So didn't really push her in one direction or another one. But what the result of that was is one Christmas morning she said, I used to think, Dad, that you were Santa, but now I know you're not. Okay, why do you believe that? That's interesting. Explain that to me. So she said, well, I got a Razor scooter. I got a Game Boy. In fact, I got everything on my list. And I don't think you would have done that. So you can't be Santa. Only Santa would have gotten me everything on my list. So I remember thinking at the time, that's pretty logical. She was progressing in her thinking, even if the conclusion that she came up was still erroneous. And sure enough, the next year, that development had proceeded to the point that she realized that I was Santa, and at some point she realized that Santa actually does exist, but in the form of the spirit and of giving and being generous at that time of year. So anyway, that's a further example of a logical thinking that 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old kids are able to display. Again, the limitation here is the inability to think logically about abstract things. So the ability to think logically about abstract things comes at about 11, 12 years of age, according to Piaget. Now, it doesn't come automatically with age. The further you go up these stages, the less likely that it's going to be universal that all kids at these ages are at the same stage. The environment does matter. You can be exposed to more things, be given more opportunities to learn about the world, or you can have a lesser ability, lesser exposure, a less enriched environment, which kind of stunts your development to a certain extent. And so the truth is that even though Piaget found back in the 1950s and 60s that abstract thinking, the ability to think logically about abstract things and to engage in hypothetical deductive reasoning, is possible in 11, 12-year-old kids, it's actually true that only about half of all college entering freshmen consistently think at this level, consistently have this ability. And in fact, it's only until about a couple of years into college that abstract thinking, formal operational thinking, is really the norm for most young people. First of all, let me give you another example of a task that Piaget used to test where kids were at with this. This is called the pendulum task. In the pendulum task, you have a apparatus. I made one out of PVC pipe, a little stand, and then an arm that goes out this way with a string attached to the end here, and then the string could be attached to a weight at the bottom here, and then you could swing that weight at the bottom of the string back and forth so that it acted like a pendulum. So what you do with this task is you give it to, say, a 10-year-old, 8-year-old, and say, look, there are 3 variables associated with this pendulum that could determine how fast the pendulum swings. One would be the length of the string. The second one would be the size of the weight that you can put on the end of that string. And the third one would be how high you start it, how high you drop it from at first. So you could start it up here, you could start it here, you could start it down here. So tell me, try to figure out which one of these 3 variables is the one or the ones that affect how fast the pendulum swings. And so I made one of these things and had these different size weights and different length of strings. And I gave it to my then 10-year-old daughter and asked her to figure it out and tell me what variables were most important or most effective in influencing the rate of the swing. And she looked at me, she looked at the pendulum. She says, I don't know, Dad, I can't figure it out. And I said, well, try something and see if you can try some through experimentation, try to figure it out. And so she put on the longest string, put on the smallest weight, and swung it from up here and found that it went a certain speed. And I said, okay, so you now know how fast that goes, but now try something else and compare it and see if you can figure it out. And then she took the shortest string and the heaviest weight, and she dropped it from about halfway down, and it swung a little bit. And then I said, okay, now what did you find when you make the comparison between the weight, the rate of swinging the first time versus the second time? And she said, I have no idea. And of course she had no idea, because she wasn't systematic in her approach to solving the problem. I then gave it to my 13-year-old daughter and asked her to figure it out. And she kind of did the same thing, hemmed and hawed, and said she couldn't figure it out for a couple minutes. And I said, try to experiment with it. And so then what she did, after some kind of haphazard trial and error, she then figured out that she needed to hold all the variables constant except for one, and then vary the one variable and see what effect that had. So she started with the string, and she kept the weight the same. She used the heaviest weight, and she always started it from up here. And she used the longest swing, and then she used the middle-sized string, and then the shortest string, and she found out how fast the pendulum swung according to each length of string. And then she took the longest string and used the smallest weight, and then the medium-sized weight, and then the heaviest weight, and dropped it all from the same level. And she found, again, what effect the weights had. And then she kept the string and the weights the same, and then she found out what effect dropping it from here or here or here had. And what she found at the end there was the only thing that matters is the length of the string. And if you think about it, you can probably figure it out. That makes sense. But I have to tell you that the first time I played with this many, many years ago, I couldn't figure it out on my own. I had to experiment with it. And when you experiment with it, you realize that the only thing that matters is how long that string is. Anyway, what Piaget has found, and I found, was that 10-year-olds are not very good at solving that problem, but 12, 13, 14-year-olds are, because they're like little scientists who have the ability to form hypotheses and use deductive reasoning to find the truth. Now, another application of this type of thinking would be when you're 15, 16, or whatever, and you're thinking about life after death, and you're thinking perhaps like I did, wow, what if my parents were wrong, and when you die, you're just 6 feet under the ground and just dead, and there forever. And I remember thinking about this early on, trying to get into what that might be like to be dead forever in the ground and not have any life. My first thought was, oh, that's got to be terrible. That's got to be one of the worst things in the world, to be just dead and not be able to be anywhere but in this coffin 6 feet under the ground. And then I thought, when I was a little less restricted and concrete in my thinking, I thought, well, wait a minute, it wouldn't be terrible. It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. It would actually be just nothing. And then I tried to imagine what nothing was. And the more I thought about it, the more I just tried to imagine just nothing and to get into this idea of what nothing might be like. And I remember at some point giving it up and going, you know what, I can't figure out what nothing is because I have no experience with that, and it would be impossible to imagine. But I remember thinking about it quite a bit at the age, some time in my teenage years. And eventually I gave it up because it was fruitless. But anyway, that kind of thinking, that kind of an ability to get into kind of scientific understanding of the abstract concepts of nothing and life after death is something that adolescents are capable and sometimes really hung up on doing. And 8-year-olds typically don't. 6-year-olds don't. 3-year-olds definitely don't. Piaget would say that the highest stage of thinking is this stage. That if you're 15 and you can do this, if you're 18, 21 and you can do this, and you are standing up next to somebody else who's 50, 60, we'll say, and that person can do this as well, then you're both at the same level. There is no higher level. Piaget felt that once you achieve this state and you use it consistently, there's no really further growth in your thinking abilities. And that's an interesting question. That means that I'm at the same level as a 64-year-old as my younger daughters would be when they first learn to do this in their teenage years or their early college years. We're at the same level. Is there a real difference between the average adult thinker and the average adolescent formal operational thinker? Piaget would say no. He would say the quality of thinking is the same, that the kind of tools that you have are the same once you achieve this level. Now, whether that's true or not is up for debate. Now, there's an alternative view relative to thinking, and that's Lev Vygotsky's view. Lev Vygotsky was a Russian in the early 1900s, and we in the West didn't really know a lot about him until after the Soviet Union fell, and we began to get some insight and exposure to some of the things that went on behind the Iron Curtain for all those years. It turned out, though, that Lev Vygotsky, without the influence of Piaget and others, had a view of cognitive development that was a little different. So he believed in the effect of the influence of the environment. That cognitive development, the development of thinking, was primarily influenced not by this biological timetable that Piaget described in his 4 stages, but by social interaction with others and nurture and learning. So Piaget is the naturist view here, and Lev Vygotsky is the nurturist view. So Piaget believed that language was merely an indication of where kids were at with their thinking. Vygotsky believed that language was a tool. Once kids learned language, then that catapulted them to a higher level to be able to think more complexly, at a more complex level than they could before about things in their environment. Likewise, he believed that the ability to socially interact with other people is not just an indication of your ability to think non-egocentrically, but interacting socially with other people allows you to gain exposure to experiences that will teach you to think at higher levels. Where Piaget is criticized now for underestimating kids' abilities and for focusing on the negative things, the things they can't do, Vygotsky, being the nurturist, was more interested in what kids can do, and he was able to show that kids have the ability to do a lot more than Piaget believed they could when you scaffold a little bit, when you give a little bit of guidance, a little bit of structure. You can see that kids have a lot more abilities than they show under Piaget's guidance or theories. So Piaget would say, here's this apparatus, show me what you can do. Vygotsky would say, well, okay, here's this little thing I want you to experiment with, and I'm going to help you a little bit, give you a couple of hints, and see what you can do with those hints. And what that approach tended to show was that these kids were able to accomplish more with that scaffolding, with that little bit of help. And so his view is a lot more positive about children than Piaget's is. I have to say, though, that I still think that Piaget was basically right in terms of some of the fundamental things that he talked about. At the same time, I do think that nurture and the environment in general does matter, and that kids' cognitive development can be sped up or slowed down based on their environmental influences. Now, some people have pointed out that there really is a difference between adolescents and adults in the way that we think. That even though Piaget believed, and there may be some truth, that the type of tools that kids have or that adolescents have when they're formal operational in their thinking are really the same tools that adults have. And there's really not a whole lot of difference between adults and adolescents who are formal operational in their thinking in terms of the ability to think. Even though that may be true, there's something about adolescents that makes them a little different. In fact, some people would talk about the kind of new type of egocentrism that is common in adolescence. So in 3, 4, 5-year-olds who are pre-operational in their thinking, they're egocentric in that they lack the ability to take the perspective of other people. What others have pointed out is that adolescents can become so enamored, so in love with their abstract view of the world, their ability to think and imagine things, that becomes kind of a blinding element in their lives and causes them to not take the perspective of other people because they're so blinded by their own idealistic and own perspective of the world. So adolescents may have the ability to take the perspective of other people, but they're blinded by their own kind of self-centered perspective. So that may be kind of a bad thing, kind of a negative element associated with abstract thinking. Some examples of that would involve these. The imaginary audience is the idea that wherever you go, there's a little spotlight on you, and the world is following that spotlight on you, and you have this imaginary audience that is following your every move. Adolescents do have a tendency to believe that they are the center of everyone else's attention, according to the research, and I can remember that. I can relate to that. The truth is that it's kind of part of the human condition. We all tend to be a little bit egocentric. We tend to think that the world revolves around us and everybody's attention is focused on us. And the reason for that is because it's hard to get outside of our own head. It's just that it's harder when it's a newfound ability, when it's a new ability that you're experimenting with and trying to make the most of. This egocentrism is stronger. But maybe you can relate to going someplace and having the bad haircut or the something or other with your appearance or your clothing, and you think that everybody's going to see it and pay attention to it and think this or that about you. The truth is that they're likely so focused on themselves they're not paying a whole lot of attention to the thing that you're so focused on. But it's a hard thing to really appreciate that, no matter who we are. But it's just most hard when we're in adolescence, according to the research. Another element of adolescent egocentrism is the personal fable. The personal fable can go in two different directions. In one direction, we might believe that we're Superman and we can do anything, and we have amazing, grandiose abilities. We have dreams that say we're going to become the next NBA superstar, or we're going to be the president of the CEO of some Fortune 500 company, the president of the United States, or a neurosurgeon who's going to rid the brain of all sorts of maladies that people might have, the person who's going to solve the riddle of cancer. Those are great, and sometimes they're inspiring, but sometimes those dreams are just totally unrealistic and impractical. And at some point, we need to give those up. So in my case, I was going to be a professional basketball player. I was going to be a superstar. And it was so impractical that I neglected to really pay enough attention to the fact that I got cut from my freshman basketball team and couldn't really dribble well with my left hand. And my mom was like 5'3", and my dad's 5'7". I just didn't have the genetic endowment and the potential, and I probably didn't have the motivation that I needed to get where I thought I was going to go. And yet I clung to that belief for a while. And I remember my parents and others encouraging me in that area and other areas. At some point, though, I began to realize, you know what? My parents lie. I can't really do anything I want if I set my mind to it. That's the way I was raised. Mark, you can do anything you want if you set your mind to it. And that was inspiring, and that was helpful, and that really was something I ate up and I bought into because of my abstract thinking abilities. But it really wasn't true, and it wasn't really until I was an adult into my 20s and maybe even later that I began to realize that there's a more realistic, practical way of looking at those things. And I think my life was better once I had abandoned all these kind of idealistic thought processes as an adolescent. Now, another negative side of the personal fable is the idea that if I the first one, actually, let me mention this. The first one is about if I can imagine it and make it so real in my head, it can be real in reality. But the second negative part of this is if I can't imagine it, if I can't imagine being dead in the ditch due to a DUI, then it's not going to happen. I don't need to worry about that. Now, forget about the fact that I don't really take appropriate precautions, but it's not something I really need to worry about because that happens to other people, but not to me. If I can't imagine my girlfriend being pregnant at the age of 15, then it's not going to happen. I don't need to worry about that. Now, forget the fact that we're not using proper protection. It just happens to other people. What that leads to is something called pseudo-stupidity. Smart, intelligent, abstract thinking, idealistic thinking adolescents engage in a lot of risky, stupid behaviors in spite of the fact that they're so smart. It's acting stupid even though they're really not. And I think this is true of all people, true of adults, but it's more true of adolescents. And of course, one of the reasons for this is because the last part of our brain to develop is the front part of our frontal cortex, which allows us to be more realistic and practical and to take more things into account and to have more rational and logical thinking. Another aspect of pseudostupidity is I remember dealing with our young adolescents when they were growing up, my daughters, and hearing them argue and debate positions and being so focused on winning the argument and looking at it from their own perspective that they had no ability to see that they were arguing themselves into a corner and arguing things that were indefensible. And at some point, my wife and I would give up and say, "I'll forget this argument." And I think that my daughter would go away thinking, "Oh, I won that argument," when we just gave up because they were sounding so stupid. Smart kids sounding stupid. Anyway, that kind of pseudo-stupidity was quite common among my adolescent teenage daughters. Now, hypercriticism is another example of egocentricity in adolescence. Adolescents tend to, because they can think about the ideal parent, the ideal school, the ideal society, they begin to be critical of that, of reality. No wonder, Dad, I have so many problems with you. Look, on a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being ideal, which I can now think of really well because of my ability to think abstractly. That would be great if you were there, but you're not there. You're a 7, you're a 5. No wonder we have so many problems. You need to shape up. When you can compare the idea with reality, which you can really only do when you are an abstract thinker, then your tendency to be frustrated with reality and critical of reality is increased. So one of the reasons why adolescents may be so critical and frustrated and annoyed with things that are going on around them is because of their formal operational thinking. And of course, that's a good thing, but change can happen, appropriate change can happen when people are critical and can think idealistically and beyond reality, but it can also be blinding and create other issues. So anyway, there's some good with the bad here with all this adolescent egocentrism. Now, I want to point out that these problems tend to never go away from us in our lifetimes, but they're more problematic in adolescence. So that is the reason why some people believe that Piaget was not quite right in that there are 4 stages, and the 4th stage, the formal operational stage, is the highest one, and you don't advance beyond that. Some people believe that adolescent thinking is in general not quite as good or as high of a level of thinking as general adult thinking. Adult thinking is less egocentric. It's more practical. It involves more ability to think relativistically. So when you're a young adolescent abstract thinker, you tend to not have an ability to understand that most things are relative. I do remember now, looking back on my younger years, the world was much more black and white for me then than it is now. Today, for me, most things actually depend. Most of the truths that I thought were black and white and I totally relied upon and clung to I realize now are a lot more gray and ambiguous and unclear to me than they were before. So adults have a better ability to deal with the relativity of life and better ability to think practically as opposed to idealistically. Adults have a better ability to find problems as opposed to just solve them. So abstract formal operational thinking gives you the tools to form hypotheses and to test them systematically and find truth. But who are the people that show us the problems that need to be worked on? Who are the people that find the problems that abstract thinkers and hypothetical deductive reasoners can solve? Well, they tend to be more wise and experienced adults. Dialectical thinkers are not just problem solvers. They have the ability to actually see problems from multiple perspectives, to carry on an argument with themselves and to take this position and that position in turns. and maybe find arguments and support for all sides of an argument as opposed to just finding the one true one. Adolescents want to win the argument. Dialectical thinkers just like to have the argument or debate and find value in just discussing and working through looking at all the issues, all sides, as opposed to just the one that might be the correct one. So these are, real quickly, these are 4 ways in which adults have been deemed to be perhaps different from adolescents. Now the truth is that some adults are stuck in pre-operational, concrete operational thinking, and some young children are using what's called post-formal operational thinking. And so it varies a lot, but there's a tendency, some people would say, for perhaps adults to be at a higher level than adolescents. And this greater level would be called post-formal operations, a 5th stage. Now, Piaget didn't come up with this, but if he did, or if we added to his theories, this might be the 5th stage. All right, so most of these theories of development are stage-like. They suggest that we go through stages. Now, that's debatable. Maybe we don't really go through discrete stages, and it's more gradual and continuous, and it's hard to differentiate between this stage and that stage. But nevertheless, throughout history, many developmental psychologists have tried to describe development in terms of discrete stages. Moral development is another one of those types of developmental theories that involve stages. So Lawrence Kohlberg devised these ethical dilemmas that he gave to people in terms of a little story, and he asked them to determine what's the right or the wrong thing to do in this ethical dilemma and why. So explain why you think this is the right thing and why this is the wrong thing. And what he found was that people tend to go through, starting at a young age, they tend to go through 3 distinct stages. Now, you have different levels in each stage, but we'll just focus on the 3 stages. The first stage that people go through in determining right and wrong and what's ethically the right thing to do. The first stage is called the pre-conventional stage. This is the stage in which the focus is on concrete consequences. This is the right thing to do, and it's right because the consequence is a positive one. If I do this and I get a positive consequence, then it's the right thing to do. If I don't do this, then, and I get, if I do this and I get a negative consequence, then doing that must be the wrong thing to do. So basically, this is a young child's perspective. If I do this and my parents punish me, then it's wrong. That's the criteria for determining what is right and wrong. Now, years ago, there was a tendency to study date rape a lot. Now, date rape hasn't gone away. It still happens, but it doesn't seem to be kind of the fad research topic anymore. But back in the day, we're talking about, say, 15 years ago, they would typically go to college campuses and present males with a specific scenario. You're out on a date. Imagine you're out on a date with this girl that you like. She likes you. You may have dated before even. You're having a good time on the date. You're becoming more sexually aroused as the night goes on. As the night goes on, you want to have sex with her. You make that known to her, and she says no. If you thought that you could force her to have sex against her will, if you could force her to have sex with you, would you force her? What the research found was that anywhere from about a third to half of all college-age males studied in this kind of context said that they would force her to have sex against her will if they thought they could get away with it. Now, even though this is a type of thinking, as I just described it, if the consequences are positive for doing something, then it's right. If the consequences are negative, then it's wrong. Even though that sounds like a 3-year-old's or a 2-year-old's view of morality, that's the same kind of morality, I think, that exists in the mind of somebody who says, if I thought I could get away with it, I would do it. So that's kind of to show that even as adults, we can be pre-conventional in our moral thinking. Kohlberg found that the second stage of moral development is the conventional level. This stage says that if the law says it's right, then, or if most people say it's right, then it's right. It's the thing I should do because that's the law. If the law says it's wrong, or the norms, or most people say it's wrong, then it's wrong. The research also says that most adults stop at this level. When it comes to most things, we base our sense of right and wrong, what's morally correct or incorrect, on the law and what most people believe. However, the problem with that type of thinking is that we have, throughout our history, had laws and norms and conventions that were simply, upon retrospect, immoral. Some people would say that it's immoral and inappropriate, incorrect, and unethical to structure a society the way it is now, in that 1% of the world's population controls, half the world's income, half the world's money, or whatever it is. It's immoral that I have to pay taxes on the extent that I do on my income. It's immoral that I don't have access to health care because I have this kind of employment. It's immoral that I have to sit in the back of the bus because of my skin color. Of course, that may not be the case anymore, but it's immoral that I am subjected to more police brutality and more deaths at the hands of policemen because of my skin color. Just because this is the way it is doesn't make it right. And so anyway, the flaws associated with conventional thinking in terms of morality. The third stage of development, morally according to Kohlberg, is based on ethical principles, abstract ethical principles. Now, some research shows that in order to operate at this level of moral development, you have to be a formal operational thinker. You have to be able to think logically about abstract concepts. And so this would be most common for children above the ages, teenagers above the ages of 10, 11, 12, 13. Kohlberg said this was the highest stage of development. Now again, I want to point out that the research shows that most people stop at the conventional level. This is their basis for determining what's right or wrong. And yet the people who move on to the post-conventional level, which supposedly is the higher stage according to Kohlberg, are more likely to be male. So that has led people to realize this is largely actually a sexist Western model and is likely the way it is because of the examples that Kohlberg used, the context that he used in his study, and the fact that in most of the Western world, in fact, males are raised to be more independent of others, whereas females are raised to be more interdependent, to care more about other people, to think more about relationships and the context and the situations involved. Males are raised to be more focused on principles as opposed to the practical reality of things. And so it kind of makes sense because of that males would be more likely to end up at this type of thinking within the examples that Kohlberg used in his study. Therefore, to say that this is the highest stage of moral development seems incorrect in some ways. Otherwise, we're forced to say that males operate at a higher level morally than females. Kind of hard to believe. All right, so Carol Gilligan, you can learn more about her in the book. She's been pretty critical of Kohlberg's stages and the fact that they're kind of focused on a Western primarily and a male view of the world. However, I do think that there's something, like most of these things we've talked about, there's something worthwhile in Kohlberg's stages. The pre-conventional level of thinking is fairly childish. The conventional level of thinking is pretty common, and yet it has some issues. And thinking moralistically involving abstract principles does seem to have benefits, even if it has its problems as well. All right, let's move to another type of development. This would be social and emotional development. as conceived by Erik Erikson. Now, Erik Erikson was a neo-Freudian. He was actually a student of Freud's and had interaction with Freud, but he tended to focus more on ego development as opposed to id development. So, whereas you could say that Freud's theory was all about the animalistic, id-driven components of ourselves, and most of the theory focused on those elements, Erikson wanted to focus more on the ego and its role and how it develops across the lifespan, where Freud was primarily focused on the first 5 to 7 years of a person's life. Erikson realized that development was a lifelong process, and he developed as opposed to 5 stages of development. Freud's 5 stages, which a lot of people don't talk about a whole lot because they're not really highly regarded, and we haven't in this class, and I won't. He talked about the oral, anal, phallic, latent genital stages. Erikson's stages were 8 stages, and they went from birth to death. So trust, autonomy, initiative, industry, identity, intimacy, generativity, and ego integrity. The first 5 stages of Erikson's stages definitely align themselves with Freud's stages, but Freud was focused more on sexuality and anatomy. Erikson was focused more on social and emotional issues associated with some of the things that Freud talked about. I actually think that Erikson's ideas were kind of intuitive, that if you or I were to come up with the major things that we needed to accomplish and learn socially and emotionally in the major 8 stages of our lives, we would likely come up with the same things that he came up with. For instance, the very first stage, I know you can't see this on the screen, but the very first stage for Erikson in the first year of life is the trust stage. This is the stage in which you must learn that you can trust your environment and your caregivers to take care of your basic needs, to give you what you need, that the world is a safe, trustworthy place. If you don't learn that, then it's going to sabotage the rest of your life socially and emotionally. You're going to have a hard time building upon that and developing the skills that you need to develop in order to be a fully functioning human being. Now, let me give you an example that relates to this. When our 3rd daughter was born, she was a couple weeks old. She was back in the back bedroom asleep, and my wife was talking to her sister in the family room. And while they're talking, the baby woke up, started crying, and my wife went to go take care of her, as she does and did. My sister-in-law said to her, "No, you don't want to run to a crying baby and take care of those needs too readily and too well, because what will happen is your child will learn to manipulate you. Your child will be the type of child that has you wrapped around her fingers and will be that bratty, temper tantrum, difficult to deal with child. And so you have to teach her at a young age to be a little more self-reliant, to be more independent. And you start that now by not running to a crying child, not running every time that she cries. You'll reinforce her crying, and that would be a problem. So the question is my sister-in-law right, or is my wife right? In her approach to running toward the crying child. Well, what would Erikson say? Erikson would say, based on the idea that trust is the most important thing to establish socially and emotionally in the first year of life, he would say that the surest way to create a temper tantrum throwing, bratty 5-year-old child is to not meet their basic needs and not teach them that the world is a trustworthy, safe place to live in the first year or 2 of life. In fact, the research says that babies who are not tended to, whose basic needs are not taken care of, basically learn to be very distrustful of the environment, and they tend to be what some of my foster parent students told me many years ago. They tend to be somewhat unlovable. I used to teach foster parenting classes to people who dealt with foster kids in their homes, and they used to tell me that the hardest child to deal with in their homes was a child that had been in the system from a very young age and had been passed from home to home without any consistent, reliable caregiving. When you get them in your home, you may be the best foster parent and give them all the love and attention that they need, but they're never convinced that you're still going to be there tomorrow. They don't respond in the appropriate, normal way to the love you give them, because it's as if they don't expect that you will be there tomorrow. You'll be there for them, and so they don't really buy it. And so in that sense, they call them unlovable. Basically, the idea here is that you can't spoil a very young infant. And you have to realize that their basic needs are things, once those are met, then they have the ability to rise above those needs and learn more important social and emotional skills and other things that will be part of a well-rounded human being. But at first, they need to be fed, they need to be given milk, they need to be given contact, comfort, touch. They need to be safe and secure. And when we take care of those needs, then they learn that they can go out and venture on their own when the time comes and have experiences and take steps toward their own independence, because they have learned that the world is basically a safe place. Now, it may not be totally, completely safe for some people and for most of us in some way, but it's still better to be able to experience with the world and take in all the positive that it has to offer, if we're a little more willing to take the initiative, feeling like our initiative will be rewarded with positive things. Once we have that ability to take the initiative on our own and to be a little more independent because we feel like the world is trustworthy and a safe place in general, then we have a better ability to learn from the environment the things we need to learn and to experience the experiences that we need to have in order to grow and develop. Now, at some point, and I'll use the example of letting a crying child cry on in the middle of the night rather than bring him into your bed, or give them a bottle or a pacifier. This is an issue that most parents have to deal with at some point with their very young infants. At what point do we let them cry through the night and teach them to sleep without getting up in the middle of the night and without coming into mom and dad's bed? Every parent has to figure out what's best for them and how to work that out. And yet, I think the point here is that whenever you decide to do that, you need to be consistent. So part of being a trustworthy parent, or a responsive parent, it's called, is to be a consistent parent, a reliable parent, so that your child knows that if I cry when I'm legitimately hungry and have a wet diaper and I'm getting diaper rash or something like that, if I cry, then that gets taken care of. But if I cry in the middle of the night, I've learned that if it's not the kind of cry that I give when I'm in pain, or I'm terribly hungry, or I can't breathe or whatever, my parents aren't going to respond to me, and that's okay. I can live with that. So at some point, when you kind of teach your children the ropes and the way that it really works when they cried needlessly in the middle of the night, they learn that they can rely on that, and they learn that the world is trustworthy in that sense as well. When I engage in this behavior, I get this kind of outcome, and I like that outcome, so I'm going to continue to do that. And when I get engaged in this behavior, I don't get the outcome that I like, and so I'm not going to engage in that behavior anymore. So that's part of being a responsive, trustworthy parent as well. It's not just spoiling your kid with every attention and affection that you can possibly give them. It's being a responsive, trustworthy, reliable parent that your kids can predict and actually manipulate to a certain extent. Independent kids, older kids, are developed from dependence to begin with. And it actually is an important lesson for your kids to learn. I can manipulate the world to a certain extent. I can get the outcomes that I want. Now, there's no guarantees, but I can generally increase my odds at getting the outcomes I need or I believe I want by doing X, Y, Z. And so I'm going to learn to do those things. Kids learn that by parents meeting their basic needs for the most part in the first several months of their life. Now, I won't talk about these next stages too much, but the next stage for Erikson is autonomy. It has to do with terrible twos. Kids are throwing temper tantrums because they want to be autonomous. They want to do things by themselves that their parents used to do for them. This is a normal, natural kind of a willful state that kids go through in the second year of life or so. After that, they go through what's called the initiative stage, 3 to 6 years of age, where they learn to take the initiative on their own and do things that are beyond just feeding themselves and dressing themselves, involve more complex behaviors. And through that process, they learn further what's right and what's wrong and what fits and what doesn't in terms of things that they take the initiative in doing. After that, between the ages of 6 and 11, kids learn the value of industry. They learn the value of effort. And if I work hard and do this, then I can accomplish things that I want, things that are worthwhile and get me good results. And then after that, we enter into adolescence. So I want to point out that adolescence is a stage of development that's probably become much longer over the years. Erikson had adolescence from 11 to 20. It's probably more like 10 to 30 these days. It's the stage within which you find out who you are, what you really are about, what you like, what you don't like, and what kind of mark you're going to leave on the world, where you stand in terms of political beliefs, religious beliefs, where you become more aware of your strengths and your weaknesses and have a better idea of who or what you're going to stand for or be. Now the question is how best to establish this identity. Also, I want to point out that identity development probably is a lifelong process. It's just that the foundation is established here. If you establish a strong foundation here, it may be tweaked, it may be reworked throughout the rest of your life at various times. But if you have a good, strong foundation here, then that tweaking you do later on is going to be less likely to cause major upheaval and mess up other things that are happening in your life, such as the relationships that you developed along the way. For instance, if you establish a relationship with somebody before your identity is really complete and before you've really explored and developed your true identity, then that relationship is likely going to go through a lot of troubles and turmoil down the road as you change in the midst of that relationship, when the person that you have that relationship is depending upon you being the person that you were when the relationship started. And that can create issues down the road. And we'll get to that more in a minute. But the point is that identity development does occur throughout the lifespan. There will be changes, but you pretty much, according to the view here, you pretty much want to minimize the changes that occur later on by establishing the right identity early on for you, the one that fits, the one that works. How is this done? Well, most researchers would say it's done through appropriate experimentation. Commitment to an appropriate identity for you through crisis. The word crisis is meant to be experimentation, exploration, and some period of time where you try things on and it can be frustrating because they don't fit. It doesn't really work quite right for you. There can be some period of confusion and conflict and questioning. That's going to be that type of crisis. It doesn't have to be on a major level, but to some degree there has to be some kind of crisis to be able to appropriately establish your true identity, the one that works for you. So as an example of this, many years ago, talking 15 years ago, there was a study done at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, where they tested incoming freshmen and sophomores' self-esteem, their emotional maturity, their emotional health, and they also questioned these people on the extent to which they had abused drugs. Not hardcore but usage, but to the extent to which they had experimented with the use of drugs. And what they found was that the UC Berkeley College freshmen and sophomores who had achieved the highest levels of emotional maturity at that point in their lives were the ones who had abused drugs, who had experimented with different drugs. Now, it's the kind of result that I want to talk about with a little bit of hesitation and a little bit of explanation, but I get it. I don't want you to believe that you have to abuse drugs. You have to experiment with life in that way in order to be emotionally mature. That's not what the study shows at all. But what it does suggest, I think, is that if you, on the other hand, when you say, I'm not going to abuse drugs because the police officer at school, the DARE officer, says, no, you cannot, because my parents say no, that's called identity foreclosure. You're not actually determining for yourself if that is right or wrong. You're not experimenting with it in any way. You're just buying it without really trying to understand what's going on there. And I do believe that you can choose to not experiment with drugs through vicarious experience, through the experience of others. You can determine that it's not right for you, that it's not good, by looking at the dumb things that other people do, and the consequences that other people experience when they either do or don't experiment with drugs. Likewise, moving on, if you decide that you're going to be a nurse, a doctor, an engineer, a lawyer, or something like that, or anything along those lines, because that's what your parents want, that's where you can make a lot of money, that's where there's a lot of jobs, that's where society is pushing you because of the trends, then you're engaging in identity foreclosure. You're not going through any kind of crisis or experimentation. You're not finding out if it really works for you, if you really like it or not. And it may take some time. It may be frustrating where you try out something that doesn't quite work, and you have to tweak it. But that's the nature of identity development. If you don't go through those frustrating, conflictual, difficult times, then you foreclose on that identity just because that's the direction that's easiest, or that's what your parents want, or you think society wants of you, then that's when you wake up 10 years later and you go, you know what, I hate this. And I'm not really sure that I ever really appropriately determined that this would fit me. Religiously, I've wanted my kids, they're older now, so it's kind of a done deal, but I wanted my daughters, to follow in the religious footsteps that we had laid out for them. But I realize that if I want them to do that, the inappropriate way to get them to move in that direction would be to force them, to not allow them to think about it and to have their own freedom of choice in terms of how they operate with religion in their lives. They need to find out for themselves. That is going to be the best way for them to be firmly committed to the choices that they make, and hopefully the choices that they make down the road are the ones that I think are best for them. But I certainly don't want them to foreclose on the choices that I think are best for them. I want them to find out for themselves so that they'll be firmly established and be more committed than if they were forced into it through some sort of means. So the commitment through crisis, which is what James Marcia called it, as opposed to identity foreclosure, which is when you kind of choose an identity without any kind of real experimentation or thinking it out, or experimentation, safe experimentation, legal experimentation on your own. Today, you're forced as college students to choose a major pretty early on. And I think that precludes a lot of experimentation that really should be a part of this kind of development. And I think that a lot of students are going into nursing and engineering and medicine because there are a lot of jobs, because it pays well, and because there's a lot of prestige. But those aren't the right reasons, I think, in order to pursue those careers. You have to find out if they really fit for you and if you would really like them. And hopefully you can do it in such a way that you can experiment a little bit before you get so involved that it's hard to turn around when you find out that it doesn't really work for you. The next stage of development, according to Erikson, is intimacy development. This is where you, once having established your identity, you find somebody to share that identity with. Now, Erikson would say that the most important thing you can do socially and emotionally as a young adult from the ages of 20 to 40 is to have intimate relationships with other people, to share your life socially with other people, to commit yourself to these relationships. And you'll learn something more about yourself and develop socially and emotionally more so than you otherwise could if you didn't have these intimacy experiences with other people. Now, in the traditional sense, this would be a heterosexual relationship with one other person that involves a family with children. Now, we don't live in the traditional world so much anymore, and so more and more we're beginning to realize that you can establish this kind of intimacy and the learning associated with it that Erikson was talking about through relationships that are same-sex, and maybe they don't have to involve marriage, and maybe they don't have to involve kids. But I think it's a truism that when you have somebody else to share your life with, good or bad, fraught with all sorts of difficulties or not, when you have somebody else to share all that with, then your life is richer. And you know more about yourself and learn more about yourself than you otherwise could if you don't have those other people to share your life with. That's the point of this stage, intimacy stage. There could be many, many types of intimacy and many variations, but we need to have somebody to share our lives with. And most of the research says that the happiest people on the planet are those who have intimate relationships with other people. Now, the generativity stage is the seventh stage. It's the typical midlife crisis stage where after establishing your identity and your intimate relationships that you hope will last for a while, you then become more focused on what you want to get out of the remaining years of your life now that you're over the hill. So at the age of 40 or greater, and the age probably gets older as we go on and we live longer, you're over the hill. You can see death for the first time in your life directly, because before it was only on the other side of the hill and you couldn't really see it, but now you're on the downhill side looking down at it. And so it begins to drive your view of your life a little more fully than it did before. You now want to, instead of focusing so much on yourself and your one or two significant intimate relationships, you're focusing more on leaving a legacy that will outlive you. Being generative to something in society or somebody or some concept in your life that will leave a mark and make a dent and influence other people and the world in some way that will outlive you. So again, that's called the generativity stage. It's meaning all about leaving a legacy, leaving a mark on society. The last stage is ego integrity. This is what you experience when you're years away, several years away from death, and now you can see it more cleanly and more clearly, and you're thinking about it more commonly in terms of how you feel about it and how adjusted you are to it. So the fact is that most older adults who are facing death do not fear it as much as younger adults. The reason for that, according to Erickson, is because they are experiencing ego integrity. They are forced to take a look at their life and put it all into one integral circle that is complete, that has closure on it. If at this age you look at your life and you have chunks of your life that you can't accept because you made mistakes that you feel like were terrible and you wish you hadn't have done, and you can't see any benefit of that type of your part of your life, then you're probably going to fear death more. You're going to have unfinished business and regrets, and that's going to cause you to go into death with a lot more fear and trepidation than you otherwise would. The people who fear death the most across a lifespan are young adults and teenagers. Teenagers live in denial because they're thinking they're invulnerable and exempt from the things that lead to death. But still, the fact that they tempt death through their risky behavior, according to some perspectives, is an indication of how much they actually fear death. Young adults more consciously are fearing death because they have so much that they want to accomplish, and it's not really being accomplished yet because they're not old enough, they haven't had enough years, and so they would definitely feel incomplete if their life were to end at that point. Older adults have a better ability to put it all into perspective and to realize that, yeah, that was a difficult time in my life, but I still learned a lot of things, and I regard it as valuable. In the first several years of our married life, my wife and I struggled with poverty as young college students and uncertainty when it came to employment and my future, because I was in school so long when we were first married, and we had kids at a very young age. So my wife had postpartum depression and difficulty with the pregnancies, and looking back on it, she often says, "Oh, I wish we would have waited to have kids and put off some of these things until later when we were better able to deal with them." And so she kind of has a difficult time putting closure on her life and accepting those parts of our lives. And she says our life would be so much better if we did it differently when we were younger. And for my part, I tend to say, yeah, but the reason why we have a good life now is not in spite of the choices we made and the experiences we had back then, but because of those experiences. And it's all valuable. And what we learned back then, even though they were difficult times, were things that help us now. And so in that sense, I don't regret those years at all. And yeah, they were tough, but they were important and valuable. And I think that's a good example of what Erickson meant by this ego integrity that we naturally strive for and most of us achieve as we get older. All right, now that's Erickson's stage view of emotional social development. Notice that it's a very step-like, mechanical, discontinuous developmental kind of idea theory here. Many people would say that development really isn't like that. It's much more gradual and dependent upon other things as opposed to age. In fact, some would say that development actually looks more like this. Maybe it starts out somewhat predictable and kind of standardized in the first several years of life, but then it sort of changes depending upon a lot of things in one's environment. And so Bill's developmental pattern may look pretty predictable and like Erickson described the first few stages, and then he sort of takes his own pathway. And then Jane similarly looks a lot like Bill, and John looks a lot like Bill and Jane early on. But then they each take their own path in terms of development, and they're dealing with a lot of different issues that may be very different from each other as the further they go on in their life. This leads many people. This kind of view suggests to many people that development is more continuous and less stage-like the older that we get. In fact, it's probably easier to predict what's going on in the lives of a 3-year-old, of a group of 3-year-olds, than what's going on in the lives of a group of 40-year-olds if we had them all in the same room. Many people will respect Erickson's stages early on, his earlier stages more so than his later stages. And it's also important to point out that he had 5 stages covering the first 20 years of life and only 3 for the next 60, 70 years. So obviously, like the trait theory of personality, when you're trying to fit 8 billion people into 16 different personality types or something like that, you're going to cut a lot of corners and generalize and have a theory or a way of looking at things that's going to be a lot less predictable, a lot less predictive, and a lot less valuable. The same thing is true for Erikson's stages in adulthood. 3 stages covering 70 years is going to cover too much variety to be real useful in describing the kind of development that occurs for adults in adulthood. Okay, that was a long chapter, but there's a lot of material there that it's kind of hard to get in an hour, a little over an hour. So hopefully you enjoyed the concepts and made you think. I hope that your development is going well and you're enjoying your life and it's valuable and rewarding for you. I'll see you next time.